what is the actual problem with the eval thing? The problem is not that it is reasonable for scientists to think about how to evaluate dangers from AI systems. This is a completely reasonable thing to do. This is, we can argue about, is it the most efficient thing to do? Are they doing it correctly? Fine. The same thing as, is it a reasonable thing for a lung cancer scientist to study what chemical components of tobacco smoke cause cancer? I think this is an extremely reasonable thing to be studying, right? The question is, how does this relate to the political process? Who is setting the bar of evidence? If tobacco companies got their way, they would say, well, once you've identified what chemical causes cancer in cancer smoke, okay, sure, then of course we'll regulate it. But until then, well, let's wait and see. And that's the actual problem. So the scientists aren't necessarily doing anything wrong, but they are being used.
This is Daniel Fagelli. You're tuned in to The Trajectory. This is our 5th episode in our AGI Governance series. We only have one more left, and our episode this week is with Connor Leahy, not only the finest mustache in the AI safety world, but also one of the most cutting wits. Connor is known for his very vocal and articulate critique of current progress towards AGI in what he considers to be a very reckless way. And in this report, we dive deeper into his recent report called The Compendium, and we speak about AGI governance in practice. And importantly, towards the back of this episode, we talk a lot about what influence towards AGI safety looks like. Many of us who are in the intergovernmental world, the OECD, the United Nations, know that there's many people in the room that actually are quite frightened by AGI, but don't speak up. Don't talk about it. Even people who are known to have these opinions and who are worried for their own lives. Connor talks a lot about what it takes to wake up that sort of latent force and get people on the same page about asking the great powers to get on the same page about AGI. Lots more psychology than I thought we'd have in this episode, but it was a hell of a lot of fun to unpack. And I found Connor's wit as sharp as ever in this episode. So I hope you enjoy it. Without further ado, this is Connor Leahy here in The Trajectory. So Connor, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, glad to be able to dive in and catch up a little bit. Again, enough Twitter conversations where it feels like I've gotten to dive deep on your ideas, but we're going to finally be able to go a little bit further here. And the series is all around AGI governance, lots of different perspectives. Some people are familiar with yours. The first question here is around sort of where on a 1 to 10 you think AGI governance, like real kind of hard governance on some level internationally, should score on kind of a 1 to 10 today. So not like where the tech will be in 5 years or 2 years, but sort of today. People know you're maybe higher than some others, but where would you score yourself in that regard if we're just talking about November 27, 2024?
I mean, I definitely say as close to a 10 as we can get without it being an actual, break norms kind of emergency. Yeah. I think we are still within the realm where everything should be done by normal protocol. I think we should engage by normal civil means in every degree whatsoever. And but in the civil realm of lawmaking, legislation, policy, and so on, I would say there is few things, if anything, that I think are of higher priority at this point in time.
Yeah, I tend to be congenial with that thought in some regard. I mean, the exact how, I think everybody will differ, but certainly high priority. In terms of why, I think some of the why that I've seen you articulate well has had to do with agency. There are people, as you and I were speaking about before we started rolling here, extremely smart folks in the field, some of whom have genuinely contributed to the field, who really are of the belief in their lifetime and the lifetimes of their grandchildren, it is wholly unrealistic that AI would ever do a darn thing outside of a singular prompt from a singular human. That this idea of sort of agency or running away or loss of control is just wholly unrealistic. I've seen some of your arguments around this, but from my vantage point, this plays a pretty major role in why you're ranking closer to a 10 than a 1 here. Is that a correct assumption, A? And then B, I would love to get kind of your quick synopsis of why you think agency is likely and what you think other people should understand there.
So this word agency comes out a lot, and I think there's a little bit something to unpack here. So there's a couple things here. Like, one thing is like, what are the things I'm concerned about? Why do I think they happen, and so on? This is a relevant question. Another thing is, does agency actually mean anything as a word? Like, and do people agree on what this word is referring to? And then the third point is kind of like, these people who use this word agency or say it's not a risk, what makes them say those words? Like, why are they saying that? And like, what should we interpret from them saying those things? And I'm kind of going to go a little bit in reverse order here.
Let's do it.
Of these. So the first one is just like, okay, there are people who say something like, AI will not have agency, and therefore we must not be worried. And now, we can argue about what this means, but like, why are they saying this? And should we care? So fundamentally, for me, this is a lot like saying, well, the petroleum engineers at Shell Oil say climate change is not that big of a problem. So for me, I'm like, first of all, why am I listening to petroleum engineers at all? Like, if I'm talking about climate change and the CEO of Exxon tells me, oh, actually, I think climate change is not a big problem, I don't really update on this information. Now, you could argue, but the CEO of Exxon, he's super smart, or she, I actually don't know who the CEO currently is. And I'm sure they're super smart. I'm sure they know a lot about oil. I'm sure they know a lot about CO2. I'm sure they know more than I do about petrochemistry. I'm sure they know more than I do about emissions and so on. So should I then therefore update that maybe it's not a problem because the Exxon CEO told me? My answer is no. No, I shouldn't, because they haven't, epistemology in a social context is adversarial. It's a political process. It's not just a scientific process.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we might argue we're almost never doing truth, Connor. We might argue we're always just sort of beaming the conatus of self-interest out at whoever else we're looking at and speaking to, and sort of shooting for what we're shooting for. So I'm completely with you that sort of, you're saying when the folks who are running these labs say it. Now, there are some folks who aren't running labs where maybe you would take their ideas a bit more seriously. But I think what you're saying is some of the loudest voices associated with some of the biggest labs, by itself, that's not going to update you. So that was your first point here.
Yeah, exactly. So my first point is Yann LeCun, chief scientist at Meta, tells me his product is not dangerous. Cool. That's not information. Not really.
Yeah.
He can also make an argument separately from this, which is information. Maybe he has a technical argument that I can evaluate on its own standards. Yeah. That's totally fair, right? If the Exxon, CEO gives me a rigorous technical argument that I can evaluate, and it turns out to be a good argument, all right, fair enough. But just his opinion being this is an adversarial, it's a political statement. So Yann LeCun saying it's not a problem is a political statement. It's not a scientific statement. That doesn't mean it's not true, right? There could be truth here. So this brings us to the second point. So when people talk about agency, what are they even talking about? What does this word mean? And so I think agency is a little bit of what Marvin Minsky called a suitcase word. So, kind of like consciousness, in that there are many, many people who pack lots of meanings into these words, and a lot of these meanings are mutually contradictory or just completely pseudoscientific and just mean literally nothing. There's this thing where some people, when they talk about agency, they mean being able to output actions into an environment. And if that's what you mean, duh, obviously AIs already do that. What are you talking about? Other people, for them, it's a mystical concept. It's they have free will, they have a soul, and that's what gives them agency. And this is just pseudoscientific. There's nothing there. And it's there's this thing that happens where people will say oh, AI doesn't have agency, for example, because it doesn't have memory or whatever, right? And I'm like, oh, but look, here's an example of an AI system where it has a memory. And they're like, oh, no, that's not what I meant. What I mean is, a system that can reflect upon its own actions. And I'm like, well, here's an example of Voyager, for example, is an AI system that can build new skills and reflect upon its actions. And then they're like, no, it's only true agency if it's from the Argence region of France, It's it's just,
that's great. I like that one.
This is a genuine thing here, that the word agency is not a scientific concept. This is an important thing to understand. The word agency has no scientific general purpose, physical definition of reality. It is just different people have a vibe. It's kind of the same consciousness. Is something conscious or not? It's there's no science. It's just this guy feels it is, that guy feels it isn't. Who knows? So now, for the third point, there is a pointing here to something which is important, right? So let me be charitable to people talking about agency and try to see, like, all right, even if they're confused or maybe this concept they're using is not well defined, like, what is the intuition? What's the vibe that they're pointing at? Because there is a vibe that's being pointed to here. There is this vibe of, like, computer things aren't real. They don't do things. Like, there's this vibe that, like, a computer, it's like on the screen, it can't hurt you. It's not a person. Like a person, they run around, they do things, they have plans, they can, like, scheme and stuff like this, and they can make, whatever, right? There's an intuition around this, and there's a vibe here. So if you investigate this vibe scientifically, for example, you say, like, oh, computers can't generate long-term plans, right? Like, you might have this intuition. Well, bad luck, sorry, we've actually been doing that since the 70s. Like, since the 70s, we've had backtrack algorithms and, scheduling algorithms and whatever that can generate extremely long and complex plans in various domains. Okay, then you may say, that's not what I meant. What I meant is something like they can build plans in complex environments. And I'm like, whoop, sorry, we already have, reinforcement learning in RL agents playing complex video games, or like even like, tune transformer systems that can, create long-term multi-step plan. Like, just ask GPT to make a plan for your day and it could do it. Like, just like look at it, right? So that's not the thing, right? So, what is the thing? You're like, oh, maybe it has to, like, learn from its environment or like adapt on the fly. And I'm like, modern systems could do that too. Tell ChatGPT, do a text adventure with ChatGPT, or like walk it through a hypothetical scenario. And yes, it can react to that. So what is the thing being pointed at here? What is the thing? And so my claim is there is no thing. There is no spoon. It's just a spectrum. It's just like these things are getting, intelligence isn't magic. Agency isn't magic. It's just systems becoming more capable, solving more problems over longer time horizons and higher complexity scenarios. And there is no magic cutoff point where now it's true intelligence from the intelligence region of France.
Yeah. You mind if we unpack these?
Of course.
All right. So I want to touch on all three. These are great. So, and this intelligence and agence region thing is, at some point I'm definitely quoting that. So to your first point, I think we ought look at incentives. I mean, the premise of this show, I hate to tell you, is that everything is the Conatus. That is to say, we should suspect that all individuals and organizations are primarily acting in their self-interest, not because they're bad, Connor, but because that's kind of like what the world is. And so my suspicion, for you, this might seem like a terrible thing. I hope it doesn't, is I'm kind of amoral about this. In other words, I suspect if you run an AGI lab and you're closest to building the sand god as opposed to being eaten by someone else's, you will say it's not going to hurt us. And you'll say it's a good thing that we, hook it up to missiles. If you are not close to building the sand god, but you would like to control it, then it would behoove you to say it's the most dangerous thing in the universe, right? So some people are going to write you off. Some people are going to write LeCun off. I'm not saying they should write you off, right? You're articulating real arguments here. And on some occasions, LeCun has articulated arguments, and with all due respect to him. But I do think, yeah, we gotta look at the incentives across the board. And in my opinion, that shoots both ways. Even if I do happen to agree, in large part with sort of where you're headed here. Secondly, to your point around like agency sort of running away, this is the whole thing about kind of defining AI. Well, like that was never AI anyway, right? It's like, oh, well, that's just such and such. That was never, chess wasn't even AI. Come on. And it's like, even though like the Kasparov deal was a big deal, but the people will write it off and then they'll write off the next thing. Agency's happening there too. This idea of kind of the God and the gap, it's like, well, like God made the stars. Well, we know what the stars are. Well, no. It's the stuff behind the stars. Well, we actually have a pretty good understanding of that. Well, no. It's the stuff behind that. And so agency is sort of a similar thing. My suspicion, Connor, is that when people say agency, what they're aiming at, and I'm not saying this is right or wrong, and I'm not saying it's necessarily my definition. I would agree with you. It's completely a spectrum. And all these micro skills, these individual definitions, to your point, we've got beautiful examples of them, and we can only imagine what they would look like in an embodied form. We got a lot of biped robots coming online here. But I think what they're getting at is like something that you could just kind of drop off somewhere in like the wilderness of Omaha, and it would like build stuff and make things and like try to keep living, and like it would be it would be coming up with sort of what it ought to do next, sort of on its own accord. I think sometimes people think of agency almost like it's a bit anthropomorphic here, but it's also kind of a little bit congenial with what life is, which is to say it would just figure out what would behoove its interest to keep going in the world. This is, I think, what people imply. And currently, I don't know of an AI you could drop off in Kansas where it would take off, but we may not be far from that. What are your thoughts of, like, I'm not saying that's a good definition. I'm just saying some people hold that out there as kind of like the, well, it's not here yet definition. Do you see that as what you bump into in your debates?
I mean, yes, we don't have AGI yet. Like, I am in full agreement with this. There are things that AI currently cannot do. Superintelligence does not currently exist. If it did, the world would look very different. So whenever people tell me things like this, I'm like, okay, sure, I guess that will be solved. Like, sooner or later, someone will build AI and robot systems that you can drop in Nebraska and that can build industrial civilization.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, they don't exist today. I agree with this. Yes. Otherwise, we wouldn't be having this conversation. If there was a colony of super intelligent robots in Nebraska, I think humanity would, that would be our last day.
I'm more or less in agreement with you here. I do think there's a bit of a distinction. I could imagine a world where there is a robot in Nebraska just kind of surviving, building shelters, doing, trying to harvest energy in some weird way, where it also is not capable of a lot of kind of communication with us or with replacing us in all economically viable and useful ways. I think that there could be a version of that sort of like agentic, almost life emulating AI that isn't quite AGI, but it would strike me that if we got to AGI, it would seem ridiculous to think we wouldn't get to the latter. And I think what you're saying is there's all these components of, well, what is it really? It's planning. Well, what is it really? It's reflecting on itself. Well, what is it really? And what you're saying is the what is it really component Lego pieces are there. Like, it's just about when and how they click together. Like, we shouldn't imagine that this is, this vibe is often like a magical shield to protect hominids at the top of the pillar forever, right?
Yep. This is why I think it's important to understand, like, where these arguments come from. What is the generating intuition, right? And I'm not saying there's no signal in the intuition. There is signal in the intuition, but signal is not truth. So if you actually analyze, like, for example, in the compendium, document that me and some co-authors wrote, we talk about this exact thing, where intelligence isn't magic. It is just being able to solve more and more tasks, more and more patterns, more and more things. And yeah, there are some things, that AIs are currently not as good as humans are, but they're getting better. They're getting better on all relevant fronts. There's no magical hurdle. Like, could you build some kind of like chimp robot that exists in the jungle? I mean, if you wanted to, but also who cares?
Yeah, literally, no one is cares. Literally, who cares? I'm with you. I'm totally with you here. I get it.
Yeah. So the big thing is far more is that people want to build superintelligence. They want to build systems that they have on their computer or whatever that, can do remote labor, that can do science, that can persuade your political rivals to give up or, vote for you, that can, demoralize enemy populations, whatever, right? Like, whatever you're trying to build, general cognition on the computer. We have humans have built like a magical second dimension, which is made of pure thought, which is the internet, right? And so if we just have super powerful systems that can act in this domain, that's already extremely powerful. And then, from there, building an embodied system is just an engineering problem.
Yeah, I like this idea of components. If there has been something written about all those subcomponents of agency that you talked about and sort of the examples of them in the real world, I'd love to read it. And if it doesn't exist, I'd love to compile it. Because I think that's really quite a compelling piece of this. Like, here's all the Lego pieces, all the special, eternal, humans only specialness stuff. Like, here's all of it. It's just about how it clicks together and sort of when, to your point. Some people do make the argument, we're going to get a little bit into kind of like what AGI governance ideally should do. I'm sure we'll reference the narrow path here in a minute. But before we do, another argument I hear made, not as much by people in the labs, but by people who don't perceive that much AGI risk and maybe observe what the labs are doing, is they say, well, look, even if there's some risk, Sam Altman, look, hey, now he's planning on having a kid or something, surely if he thought this stuff was risky,
surely he wouldn't build it. Now, I happen to disagree with this vehemently. I mean, it's very easy to see Altman's quotes before he started OpenAI, right? It's very easy to find Musk's quotes before he started XAI. It's very easy to find Dario's quotes before, right? It's very easy. Like it's not hard, and you guys have compiled a good number of them in the compendium there. But some people really are like, well, maybe they're at a place now where the next step. If Altman thought the next step was genuinely going to be a danger for him and maybe this future child of his, he's going to raise the flag. Like, we're not going to bumble into danger here. That's an argument I often hear made. I don't want to totally make a mockery of it here, but I know you'll have a response. What is your thought there, and how would you respond in that regard?
So I think there is an intuition here, which is like superficially very compelling, which is something like if people went to work every day and they was working on something that would kill them and their family, they wouldn't do that. Like, people naturally would just stop going to that job.
Yeah.
And my answer to this is climate change. Like bumbling into catastrophe is kind of like humanity's bread and butter. Like, to big tobacco, big chemical, like big, like all these kinds of like huge external risks, externalized risk things. Normal people, like there's this intuition I think a lot of people have, is that evil comes from evil people. This is rarely true. Almost always, in the modern world at least, truly large evil is systemic. And so what I mean by this is that it can be, you can have a system where no individual person is actually doing anything immoral, but the output of the system is ungodly evil. Like, this is totally doable and happens constantly. This has happened, with climate change on both sides. Like, also some of the stuff that's trying to stop climate change causes untold, problems by like slowing down economic growth and stuff like that.
Yeah,
like, I'm not saying one side is right. I'm like, this kind of like emergent evil can exist in any kind of large bureaucratic or like, emergent group structure.
Yes.
And this is where, by bulk, like most of the large evil in the world actually comes from. It's no individual bad guy. It's just, like, for example, let's assume tomorrow Sam Altman becomes totally convinced that AGI is like the biggest risk of the world. Holy shit, we have to shut it all down, right? So he bursts into OpenAI the next day, says, burn all the servers, shut it all down, delete everything. What happens? He gets fired. He stops being CEO of OpenAI.
Yeah.
So this is what I call the cyberpunk fallacy. So, like, in cyberpunk stories, there's often this, like, oh, there's an evil CEO or, like, some evil guy who's, like, building the super weapon or something. We have to, like, stop him. And if we stop him, then, like, things turn out well.
Yeah.
But this is a fallacy. Let's say there is an evil CEO, hypothetically. Not saying Sam, but just, like, anyone is a hypothetical evil CEO. And let's say, okay, we actually get him kicked out, right? Like, we, like, protest or whatever, and we get him kicked out and whatever. Well, what happens? Well, the board elects an equally evil one the day after. It's like the problem is systemic. It's like there's a system that is optimizing for justifying profitable evilness without anyone feeling bad about it. Like, there's a deep thing where there's a big controversy during the Nuremberg trials in Germany. So after World War II, there was the Nuremberg trials where the Americans wanted to try the Nazi war criminals, but there was a genuine argument being made there. It's like, I was just following orders, and like, can you, if your superior is going to shoot you if you don't commit a war crime, and then you do it, like, are you at fault? And I think this is a reasonable argument, but the conclusion we in the West made is no. That is not an excuse. But this is not actually enforced in the real world. So there was an extraordinary time where it was enforced, but in the true world, it's not. For example, no one at ExxonMobil, no petroleum engineer is considered personally responsible for climate change, right? Like, we're not going to sue them and put them in prison for the harm that climate change has caused. We will never do that, right? I'm not saying we should. I'm saying it is the way our civilization starts. So if AGI was a huge risk, no one actually building it will be punished. And they know this. So they can just believe whatever is most fun and makes them the most money. And they don't have to be afraid of getting punished. And if people are not afraid of getting punished, they very rarely think about wider scale morality. Especially, I know how much you've been in the Bay Area and like talked to people.
Yeah, lived there for 3 years, yeah.
Yeah,
but go on.
It has a very strong culture of, I should be allowed to do whatever I want. And anyone who's against I should be able to build anything I want. I should be able to own anything I want. I should be able to, pay anyone to do anything I want. There should be
all the social norms. It extends into other stuff that's more uncouth than what you and I are articulating right now. But yeah.
Yes. And this matters a lot. Like, this is actually quite important because this is at the heart of the psychology of these kinds of things. Where, like, there's a thing where just, like, there are people who want to build AGI. They want to build God. They want to, live forever. And they're, like, willing to kill your kids for it. And they think this is okay. And they truly think this is okay. Like, this is important to understand. It's not that they're evil and think they're being evil. They're just like, oh no, this is a good thing. And I wish, if someone else did this, I would also be fine with it.
I like this idea of the systemic thing you're articulating here. I'm just going to put some ideas on the table around this because I do think this is, I do think people really do have this belief of like, no one would go to work to do something dangerous. But like, you just brought up the Nuremberg trials. I mean, we could talk about the guys building the suicide airplanes in Japan every day, right? For years, just like putting the wings on these planes, every single day, right? Like, and there's planes aren't doing anything except for having a guy die to try to sink a carrier. And so, clearly, humans do that kind of stuff. And of course, I think my presumption for all of us, unfortunately for you and I as well, is that we're mostly constructing beliefs based around what would behoove us. And then we're espousing beliefs particularly based on what would behoove us as well. I mean, Hume has this idea of like, virtue is an act from someone else that behooves me and vice is an act from someone else that doesn't behoove me. And I just think that's it. For me, I actually don't even get into evil about this. I just refer to it as amoral. Spinoza has this idea of the conatus, this sort of impetus for anything to sort of do whatever behooves it. I just see it as conatus and I step away. I don't malark it and say like, ooh, devil horns. I just say conatus. But to your point, systemic, I see this, I interpret that as incentives. The way I see it, and I want to put this on the table because something you said kind of flagged something for me. You were like, hey, they want to build God. They're willing to kind of risk it all. And, if it's plausible that they can say it's not going to hurt your kids, they'll say that just to get there. And if someone else builds it, that would be fine. I actually suspect one of the main reasons the arms race towards AGI is dangerous, and of course, we're going to get into combating the arms race in the rest of our interview today, is that you essentially have two choices as a billionaire tech guy today. There's only two today. If we freeze time where there's no mommy, there's no adult in the room, as you often say, we're just in a state of nature. You can build the sand god yourself that will probably devour you, but you'll have, who knows, a couple months, a couple days, a couple hours, maybe even a couple years, who knows, of like kind of the pinnacle of the dominance hierarchy of Earth ever. You'll have that for a minute, and that would be fucking sick. That's the final flex. That's the final flex. End of story. I mean, Napoleon is an earthworm. And so you can do that. You're going to die, and so will probably everyone else. But or there's a really high likelihood. I'm not going to say it's guaranteed, but there's a decent likelihood here. The second option is you die by another man's sand god. And in that case, you don't get the glory in those final days. In fact, your final days are knowing that someone else has the final flex and you don't. And there's this famous poem and this myth of sort of Sardanapalus, this mythical kind of Greek figure who, knowing he's about to be defeated, sort of piles all of his concubines and his gold and his servants and even his best horses into this giant bedroom on this giant bed, kills them all and just burns himself alive with them all so that nobody wins anything. Like, if he's going to go out, it's going to be on his terms. And I think men of extreme ambition, I'm not even calling them evil people here. I'm just saying men of extreme ambition. I think it's like, if I got to go out one way or another, I'm going to race and be the one to get there first. So when I look at Altman, I look at Dario in particular, we might say, of course, everybody starts the lab saying, I'm the good little guy. You remember Robespierre? Kind of same story, right? I mean, this is the game. It's called the game. There's two spectra you can compete on: perceived benevolence and just actual raw power. And you got to play both of them as much as possible. That's how power works. It's a perception management game. You got to do it. Altman's got to do it. Everybody's got to do it. It is what it is. I don't make the rules. And so everybody starts off playing the good guy points because they don't have a lot of the power points. So they play the good guy points. But like, Dario's racing, man. Why is he racing? Because like he's going to get eaten by someone else's sand god if he doesn't build it. What are your thoughts to that? Because I actually don't know if Dario would be happy if Sam built it. I think that wouldn't be good for him.
So I think there's definitely something to this general like macho vibe of like you want to be in charge and like, you know, if you're gonna die, at least kill the other guy before then and so on. But like for me, this drifts into psychoanalysis and kind of like is like not actually really relevant to the kind of like systemic things I really care about. So for me, if there's a guy who takes a bunch of innocent people onto a big bed and then kills them, I am very happy to call that evil. I am pointing directly at that, and that is an evil man doing an evil thing to innocent people. Like, this is for me so unambiguous. It's like crazy how unambiguous this is to me. Those people did not deserve to die. They didn't want to die, and he just did that for his ego. Nope, that is evil. And we should coordinate against people like this. So what does it mean when I say something's evil? Okay, we're going here. Let's talk about morality. What is morality? Why does it exist? And why do I care about it? There is the classic, cringe Reddit atheist kind of like, well, actually, all morality is arbitrary, so I can do whatever I want. And sure, like if you want to live like that, go fuck yourself. And you can't tell me I'm wrong because, you have morality.
Yeah.
So, the reason morality matters, other than for like spiritual and like reasons like that, right? And like aesthetic reasons, which matter, but like it's a different thing. The fundamental thing is that the difference between the kind of ethics I think are important for these kinds of things here and like these like more selfish, evil forms of ethics, like utilitarianism, is that you are optimizing for an equilibrium. There's this difference between like local causal decision theory, which is like, given the choices currently in front of you, pick the option that gives you the best return. There is a different kind of strategy, which is like, assume you are the kind of agent that does these kinds of things, and that other agents are agents that do these kinds of things. What kind of society results from this? For example, every individual person would benefit from shoplifting, right? Or let's say even like not returning the shopping cart. It's much more convenient to not return the shopping cart. You could just leave it in the parking lot. But for me, this is the difference between civilization and not civilization. Do you return the shopping cart? If you do, you're civilized. If you don't, you're not. It's like living in a civilized society is actually amazing.
Oh, it's great.
I live in Europe.
It's as good as it gets.
Great. The fact that I can walk down the streets and I'm pretty safe, it's quite clean. If something goes wrong, I can call the police and they will help me, is amazing. This brings me so much value to my life, and I am willing to take a lot of hits to protect this and be a part of this. I am willing to never ever hurt, or kill another person ever, even if he deserves it. I will not do it, because that's part of being a civilization, of being civilized, is that we agree, I will not do that. Even if I want to, even if the other guy really deserves it, you still don't do it. So this is the difference between like consequentialism, like utilitarianism, and deontology or virtue ethics. Is that for utilitarian, whether you murder another guy or not depends on whether you get more utility out of killing him or not. And this is a very, very dangerous way to be making decisions on a civilizational level, because you are too stupid to understand all civilization. You can't calculate all the consequences, and your hardware is compromised. So as you talk about, people are biased for themselves. They will do things that are beneficial to them. And if everyone does this, if everyone is a psychopath, if everyone is just an actual clinical sociopath, everything goes to hell forever. You can't have a civilization like this.
I follow you. I mean, look, I think it's really, really a viable argument for me to say that my not killing the neighbor is actually in my own self-interest, that my participation in society is in my own self-interest. I don't think that saying most actions are brought forth by one's self-interest implies brutal, evil, horrible things.
In practice, it does.
I think I wake up with no desire to steal because I have more reliable and less risky ways to do business where someone's willing to pay because I do something useful, and maybe I even feel a little bit better about it. I don't think I'm fighting my self-interest to move along with society.
I think you are genetically selected to have some of this stuff. A lot of humans are genetically selected to not be sociopaths. If you were a sociopath, I think things would be very different.
No, totally. But I guess what I'm saying is the position of psychological egoism, which is to say, if we get behind the motives of anything, it's probably self-interested, does not imply everyone's a psychopath, is all that I'm getting at. I think that there's many self-interested people.
But if you endorse it and you don't coordinate against it.
Oh, so no, this is the whole deal. Yeah, go on.
When I say someone is evil, or a process is evil, what I'm saying is, hey guys, we should coordinate against this.
I love this definition.
We should work together to make this not happen.
I love this. And well, this is I think where we're going to get very much into the depths and very much on the same page about governance, because I have this position of psychological egoism where I'm not willing to call anybody an angel or a devil generally, but I am willing to look at patterns and incentives or maybe specific behaviors and say, there needs to be a whole set of ways that doesn't happen anymore. And I think to your point about the police, why can you and I have this conversation? If theft and murder were legal in Massachusetts, I would have to be looking out my window behind me with a rifle, and I would not be able to entertain this intellectual hoopla that you and I are doing right now. I would have to be surviving, Connor. And I think it's a beautiful thing, to your point. We've coordinated. And sometimes coordination gets a little bit too wonky and things get too taut, but it's clear that the spectrum of coordination along the lines of the important things matter. And of course, this does get us to, what should AGI governance do? And now, the reason I brought up this psychological deal with Sardanapoulos is simply because my supposition is, Connor, if Dario is just as happy if Musk birthed the sand god as if Altman or whoever else, I think that they might sort of have reason to be like, hey, why are we racing here, guys? Let's really calibrate this to make sure this is a great and brilliant future for everybody's kids and for humanity and posthuman life and whatever. Like, I think there'd be a lot more like, cool, guys, hey, you're running for it, I'm running for it. Let's really build something great here. But I think it's more heads down, have to win, because I actually don't think they're just as happy as if the rival wins it.
Which I don't either, to be clear. This is not what I was trying to claim.
Okay, got it. So,
what I mean is far more is like, if a hypothetical super-aligned AI came into existence, for many people who are not necessarily, I'm not saying Sam specifically or Dario specifically,
okay, understood,
because that's psychoanalysis and I don't know what's inside their head, and my argument should not depend on their emotions. I don't like making arguments that depend on internal information that I do not have access to. I don't want to make an argument that depends on whether Sam is a nice guy or not, because I don't know and I don't care.
Well, yeah, it's like, he's amoral to me.
I mean, that's a different question. Morality is different from how you feel on the inside. I think morality, so for example, if you are a total psychopath, you're so evil, you don't care about humans whatsoever, and you just pretend to be nice. You just play act. You just pretend to be nice. You just do good things. You work in charity. You're good to your wife. You do all these things, but the whole time you actually didn't love anyone. Yeah, that's fine by me. Totally fine. Turns out you're a good person. Gotcha. Like for me, good is an action. It's not a state of mind. I truly don't care how people feel. If you hate being good, but you constantly act good, fine. I don't care. Like, you don't have to feel good to be good. This is very important. You can, like, if someone is just like, by some mechanism or reason, follows a good coordination and just coordinates with someone, but internally doesn't feel it, fine. I don't care. Like...
Absolutely. The result is the name of the game. And so my guess is that this race dynamic of wanting to win and not having a governance body, like, right, if you and I get in cars, the fastest cars we can get, Connor, somewhere in the UK or the US, and we just fucking start gunning it because, like, we're here to race, someone's going to pull us over because we're going to kill ourselves or somebody else. But with AGI, there is no one in the room. So we're going to get into governance, but where do you want to go?
So this is the fundamental thing, right? So the fundamental thing, the reason I don't really care about, like, this guy's nicer than that guy or whatever, is that they are all defecting on the social contract. So there's this thing where, like you said earlier, that as a CEO of an AI company, you have like two options. Either you let the other guy race or you race. I completely disagree with this. This is completely false. You absolutely have more options. Like, one option. So, okay. Like, the thing is fundamentally is that we agree, and like these people agree to, they have signed statements to this effect, is that, like, building AGI exposes unwitting civilians to risk of literal death.
Absolutely.
They all agree with this. Well, part of our social contract in a civilized country is that we don't fucking do that. Like, you don't do this. You don't, if you are building explosives in your backyard that could harm your neighbor, that's illegal and you are immoral for doing this. It's not just it's illegal. It's also you're evil for doing this, and I will coordinate against you, using laws, obviously.
Yep.
But also, you are a bad person for doing this. If you are doing experiments in your garage that threaten the lives of your neighbors, you are a morally bad person.
I'm totally following you. Let me just lay out kind of what I mean by my position here. What I'm getting at is, if I look at Dario, however many years ago, okay, you might have looked at him 5 years ago. I don't know when Anthropic started. Doesn't matter to me. Whenever it started, you might have said, Dan, I don't think this guy's going to renege on the social contract. I think no matter how strong he gets, he's not going to get into some crazy race dynamic, whatever. And again, I like that you're not having to investigate the innards of someone's head to say if they're good or bad, right?
But they already reneged by creating Anthropic.
Certainly. So all I'm saying is, I essentially, without governance structures, I don't personally trust anyone to hold the scepter. So what I'm getting at is, like, I would say, and this is, I'm not advocating for this. I'm just saying I suspect it will be the case, and this is why I think governance is so crucial, which we're going to get into. Whoever you hand the scepter to, those two choices I gave you, I don't wish they were the only two. I'm just saying they're the only two I observe, Connor. I don't observe that many other people building AGI that are also pumping the brakes, beating the table at the UN and saying, guys, coordinate us here. Like Altman will give little waves to, like, hey, this will need governance, but clearly it's going to be in ways that behoove their own interests, which is what I would expect. But our social contract is, and our legal bounds are not extending to that realm of behavior. And so I cannot trust the activity happening in that behavior. And I believe governance is mandatory for that reason. In this regard, I suspect we're of a similar mind.
Yeah, of course.
Okay. So with that said, we'll pivot into kind of the seed of what governance should achieve. You and I are right now addressing kind of the prevention of an arms race. Maybe if you could nutshell, hey, the mechanisms, Dan, the exact phases, we have some drafts, we have some ideas, but ultimately, Dan, the seed must be this. What is that for you, Connor?
If an artificial superintelligence comes into existence and it is not extremely well controlled and aligned with some form of human interest, it's game over. All policy must be focused on preventing that outcome. If we ever find ourselves in this situation where this system exists, it's too late. And we are currently heading towards this scenario. So the primary seed of policy must be to not get into this scenario. The secondary goal must then be to get to a good outcome. But the primary one is don't get into the game over state.
Yeah, I dig it. And we're going to talk about a good outcome a little bit here today, and hopefully unpack some ideas people don't know about you yet. So I like this idea of, like, this is what it should achieve. And I think there is a lot of urgency behind it, especially given the fact, as you and I have, it seems like, gotten on the same page, no matter who you put in these seats, if there's no cops and there's a reward to get across the finish line, we're just going to kind of gas it. And this is where incentives are pulling people. In terms of initial steps, the narrow path articulates kind of, 3 phases of sort of achieving potentially beneficial outcomes from AGI. When you think about what governance might look like in practice, what are the most important things that you'd want to lay on the table that you think would be good structures and that more listeners should understand?
So there's a wide range of how ambitious we're talking here, right? And how feasible things are supposed to be, how big of a steps you want to do, how inside or outside the Overton window you want to operate. I have suggestions for all of the parameters. Everything from just people in the government should say unambiguously live on TV that this is a problem.
Yeah.
This is a minimum possible thing. It makes no commitments, and still this is helpful. It is helpful because it helps with coordination. It allows, social bound intellectuals and, elites to talk about this topic. It becomes a thing they're allowed to think about. People very often in the world need permission to think about things. It's quite rare that people have the initiative to think about weird things without permission. So just giving people permission to think about this is very useful. As we go up the hierarchy of ambitious and actually tackles the real problem, there are concrete legislation that would be helpful. Everything from chip controls, KYC, things up to, for example, developer liability. which I think is one of the most useful and like established forms of common law that are extremely effective for exactly the kinds of problems that we're dealing with here. Like the kind of problem which addressed, like from a legal point, if I was a lawyer and I was like trying to talk about AI risk, I would think of it as a externalities problem. So an externality is some kind of risk or cost that comes about in the production of a product or some kind of process that is not part of the main process and is being paid for by someone else who potentially shouldn't have to pay for it. For example, pollution. Like the standard form of externality is pollution. I own a chemical company. I'm making plastic or whatever. As a side effect, it produces some kind of like toxic fumes or runoff. I divert into the nearby river and like farmer's cows dies or his kids die or whatever, right? This is an externality. Is that like, I didn't intend to kill the farmer's children. Like, I don't have anything against the guy, but, you know, it happened. So in modern, you know, tort law, the way this works is that, I mean, usually this is already illegal, but like if this were to happen, I would be liable. So this means the farmer could sue me and say, look, you caused me this amount of damage, you polluted the river, blah, blah, blah. Maybe the EPA would sue me as well, whatever, and I'd have to pay damages or go to prison or whatever. So this is how we deal with externalities. This is extremely important for market efficiency as well. So like there's this whole thing where like people, for some reason, don't understand what market efficiency means and what how market failures happen. So an example of how a market failure means a outcome happens that is just bad and people didn't want. And one of the main ways this happens is if something is unpriced. Markets are very efficient at optimizing things that are priced. If something has a price and you want to optimize that thing, markets are very good at that. They're very bad at optimizing things that are not priced. As an example, pollution. If you don't put any dollar value on pollution, then people will optimize basically to be as polluting as possible because it's free. And so the cheapest plastic will probably be the most polluting, all things equal. And so anyone who puts in effort to prevent their pollution, they install filters or whatever, their plastic is going to be more expensive, and so the market will select them out.
Yeah.
Exactly. So the way you solve this is you add the pricing back into the market. So for example, you say, you know, there's a price on carbon, there's a price on pollution, or like at least a probabilistic chance in the form of getting sued. Then people are incentivized to actually develop better chemical methods, to develop, you know, filters and actually install them. So the same thing should be happening with AI. So there's this funny thing that happened in the 70s. I think this is a great story. I've told this many times, but I think it's an important one. In the 70s, car companies pushed extremely hard to not install seatbelts in their cars. And their reasoning was, well, if someone buys our car and gets into a car accident, well, that's a user problem. Like, it's not our fault that they misused our car. Like, we build cars. You know, what do you want to do? Regulate knives in the kitchen? Pfft. Like, you want to say if someone stabs someone?
Yeah, I see this as totally viable. Yeah.
Exactly. And so importantly, this is a very reasonable argument. I'm not actually, like, this is actually a genuinely reasonable argument. It's like, yeah, it getting into a car crash is a user mistake. Like, so this is a reasonable argument. But still, obviously we want seatbelts, right? So the best practice of how you do liability in the real world is not that you put liability on who is most responsible, like morally. Instead, what you do is, if you actually want to get a good outcome, you actually want to save lives, you put liability on the part of the supply chain that is best situated to address the problem. This is totally different from who caused the problem. So someone might have crashed the car, right? Sure, it's the driver's fault, fair, but the drivers can't develop safer cars. They can't develop seatbelts and install them on all the cars nationwide. Who has all the engineers and the production facilities and the testing facilities and the money to do this? The car companies, of course. So they are the ones that should pay for this. Of course, they don't want to pay for this. And so the same thing should be with AI. Who has the engineers, the computing, the resources, the money, etc., to best address harms and like technical research and safety from AI? You know, scrappy, you know, nonprofits in the Bay Area and like, you know, underfunded government departments, or the most valuable tech companies in the world. So like, obviously, legally, the liability and the responsibility to fix these problems should be put onto the companies. It should be their problem, not our problem. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I mean, look, I'm more on your page than, I mean, you, as you can probably estimate just by our internet interactions. The idea that philosophically that I'm very congenial with here is that law is the bounding of incentives for the sake of a collective good. That's essentially what I see law as. So when I articulate ethical ego or moral or psychological egoism as what I would say we should, I'm not going to say it's real. I don't know for sure if psychological egoism is real. I act in the world as if I'm expecting most people and organizations to act in their best interest most of the time, and I don't take it personal. But that means I value civilization tremendously because it has set up norms, structures, and laws that permit me nationally and internationally to enjoy the fruits of a non-state of nature life. Which is the greatest fruits there are. I mean, this is a wonderful thing. And so this is essentially what you're articulating around AGI. Couldn't possibly agree more. And I think that sometimes there is just there are folks that are kind of waving their hand just saying, Altman's bad, Altman's terrible, we need to stop this. I think what you're saying is, hey, in all these other domains, we look at these externalities and their severity, and we find a way to bind them. Now, I can tell you, working in the AI and enterprise space, these the compliance departments and anti-money laundering, like banks don't like to have to do this. They really don't. Like, it's not because they're bad people, right? They don't wake up in the morning and say, I want people to buy and sell humans and missiles and stolen artwork through my network. Yeah, right? They don't say that, but they get a cut of the transaction. So they'd kind of prefer to not know what's going on, right? I mean, they'd prefer it'd be, look, I got to feed my kids at home. I'm not a bad guy. I just got to feed my kids at home. This is the systemic thing you talked about. I don't see any evil guys at Goldman. There might be some of them, okay? But like most of them probably aren't. But there's an incentive game here, and the government had to come on in, and they're all like, ugh, this is such a cost. But the government imposed the cost on all of them. You will all know your customer and even your customer's customer, and you will ensure that these kind of transactions aren't happening. And they sigh, and it's a big tumor of an expense on the side of all these FinServ organizations. But at the end of the day, we got a little bit less, chemical weaponry and human beings getting schlepped back and forth, and that's probably a good thing. We've decided. Some governance clearly goes awry. Intentions don't always lead to good results, but some governance is the basis of civilization. And the challenge with what we're talking about here, Connor, and I really wanted to get to your perspectives on this, is the global nature of this challenge. There are some international things around money laundering and whatnot for sure, and other trade agreements and whatnot. This is global in maybe an even deeper way. It's not just when over 10 grand is being schlepped from Singapore to Boston. This is like compute and how it's being used, or at least the big labs or what have you. How do you foresee this coordination even beginning with the Russias and the Chinas of the world being in the race? I mean, particularly China, of course, overtly racing towards AGI, just like the United States. Where does that begin?
I mean, the boring answer is it starts by talking. And this already happens. Track 2's already happened. Track 1.5
Absolutely.
Dialogues already happening and so on. But it's like, it feels like we're in like 1955 and or something, and like the Soviets have just put off their first nuclear weapon or whatever, and we're like, how does America deal with the Soviets or whatever, right? And I'm like, yeah, this is a hard problem. And if anyone tells you this is not a hard problem, they're selling you something, and something bad.
Absolutely.
It's like every people are like, oh, we can defeat the Soviets just by X, or we can ally with the Soviets just by X, are both wrong. Like, this is genuinely hard. Like, dealing with the Soviets was genuinely hard. Diplomacy is generally hard. Disarmament is generally hard. Coordinating is hard. Like, even within a nation, it's hard. Between nations, it's even harder. So anyone who claims there's an easy solution to this, right, where it's just like, oh, we just raced AGI or whatever, it's just like, no, that's not a solution. So an example I like to bring up historically is, do you know about Ronald Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative back in the 80s?
No, lay it on me.
So it's a long story, but the short version of the story is, in the 1980s, for various reasons, several people in the Reagan administration started pushing for a program they called Strategic Defense Initiative, and sometimes called Star Wars, colloquially, kind of in the media, they start calling it Reagan's Star Wars, because the point was to create a satellite-based anti-ICBM missile defense system. So the idea was that you could put these satellites into space, they could shoot down Soviet missiles, and therefore make a nuclear retaliatory strike impossible. So there was a lot of controversy from day one. Like, almost all physicists said this is physically impossible, like this is technically impossible, we can't build things like this, it's way too complicated, it would never work, blah, blah, blah. But ignoring that for a side, for various political reasons, people pushed this very, very hard. And so the approach was that they would think, it's like, if we build a strong enough missile shield, then, and this is a literal words they actually used, then the US could win a nuclear war. And that is insane. You cannot win a nuclear war. And so there was a counter movement to this, most famously embodied by Carl Sagan, the detente movement, which was saying, no, this is not a viable option because you can't win a nuclear war. Yes, it sucks that, we're at a bad problem with the Soviets and they're doing a lot of bad things. They have nuclear weapons, that's scary. We have nuclear weapons, that's scary, right? This is a bad situation. But escalating by trying to build systems like this, doesn't help because, nuclear, even if nuclear war happens, whatever, we'll still get nuclear winter and everyone dies. There is no winning a nuclear war. And this is ultimately what led to the SDI getting shut down, is that they were just like, you can't win a nuclear war, don't even try. The only strategy is to not get into a nuclear war, so we have to do everything we can to make sure we don't get into a nuclear war. If we do, it's already too late. And this is the exact same thing that has happened with AGI. It's even crazier than this. There is now a faction that, unironically, I did not make up this name. They themselves are calling themselves Entente, which is the opposite of détente. So this is people from like Anthropic, Rand, and other people who have literally said, like Dario Amode's latest essay literally mentions the Entente strategy as the opposite of détente. Crazy that they're like have this little self-awareness. And where they're saying, we can win a nuclear war, strike that AI race against China. But you can't win an AI race. There is no winning. Because building AI that is safe and leads to a good future is so hard. It is like, let me be very clear here about how hard it is to build an aligned ASI. This is equivalent to saying, we're going to take all problems that people solve day to day, all problems they solve in their work, all problems that businesses solve, all problems that the economy solves, all problems that institutions, NGOs, governments, academia, science, all of these problems, and we're going to solve all of them using software that will have no bugs and lead to a good outcome. That's how hard it is to build aligned ASI.
Yeah. Go ahead,
and so anyone who says, oh, we can do that while racing as hard as possible in an adversarial environment, I'm like, no, you fucking aren't. You're insane. This is like, whether or not this is possible is a whole other question. But assuming it was possible, this is a generational project, or like multiple generational project. And this is not the kind of thing you can do in a Manhattan project. Like, I was recently talking to someone who brought up like, well, I personally don't see how this project could be that much harder than the Manhattan Project. And I'm like, dude, the Manhattan Project was about $35 billion in today's money and about 3 to 4 years of work. I think solving all problems on Earth using software is harder than 3 to 4 years of work and $35 billion.
Yeah, I think it's extremely hard to argue against that in my personal opinion. I mean, certainly if you want an AGI that leads to some kind of positive outcomes for humans, I mean, someone might be able to argue, but even then, it's quite clear getting to AGI is going to take more than 35B. But luckily or unluckily, depending on how you want to see it, a lot of the big guys are worth multiple trillions already, and they're willing to throw huge dollars into this because they're in the same Sardanapalus race, man. Someone else is going to get there unless there's an adult in the room or there's some international coordination. I think they're probably, Dario in the early days likely would have, if you were to say, hello, I see you've started your own organization. Would you ever, do you think it'll ever be a good idea to sort of just race overtly against China, to maybe align yourself as much as possible with the military and just go pedal to the metal on capabilities to sort of beat out an international adversary as kind of the core modus operandi for the organization? I will tell you with 99.8, I can't get better than that, but I'll go there. I'm willing to go there, that, in the first year of Anthropic, you would have gotten a very clear response from Jack Clark or from Dario or from anybody that was sort of in the early days there. But incentives change, as it turns out. So if you're Robespierre and you don't actually have much military might, you sort of say, for the people, and you act in a virtuous way, and you advocate for certain things, and you get yourself closer to kind of the throne on sort of this sort of platform of virtue, and you acquire resources through the platform of virtue, because there's those two axes. And then once you have the resources, you just lop off the heads of Danton and all the other adversaries, because like the incentives change, bucko. It is what it is. Yeah.
So importantly, I think everything you say is like spiritually like true, and like it's a plausible model, but I have to inform you that this is factually wrong.
Go on.
Like, this is not what happened historically. The first pitch deck from Anthropic said that we will race ahead and have, the 2026, we'll have models, more advancement. There never was a period, like historic, I'm just setting the record
Go ahead.
straight.
No, this is great. This is good to know.
There was never a period where Anthropic was not gunning to get to AGI as fast as possible. This never existed. To be clear, I think Jack Clark and Dario would have said that to you, but I don't think they would have said it in private amongst each other.
Yeah. So you're saying in the early founding papers.
Look, like Dario broke away from OpenAI to beat Sam. That was the point.
Yeah. Oh, I think. Well, isn't it always the point? I mean, I look at everybody who's broken away. I mean,
but that's my point. I'm not saying they're uniquely bad. What I'm saying is, there is this myth, there is this story that everyone had good intentions, and just the incentives, big scare quotes, came. They descended upon these, and I'm like, no. They're never. No. Read the emails between Elon Musk and Sam Altman going back to 2015. There never was so there's a great essay which is called "The Problem Isn't the Incentives, It's You."
Go on.
And it basically makes this point, is that hypothetically, yes, incentives are a big problem. But if you actually zoom in on any specific example, you would be shocked how often incentives are actually not the problem. And how often is just like individual people making just absurdly selfish decisions that are not predetermined.
Well, in my opinion, I think we might be conflating incentives as different things here. So just to be super clear, I'm not saying, why Connor? If I could go back to Dario back in the day, I would see the virtue sparkling in his eyes. What I'm telling you is, Connor, the perception management that Dario would engage in the early days would be aligned with this. I told you, I think there's two axes to power, Buck. Like, I think there's two of them. I think there's the perception of benevolence, and I think there's the acquisition of power. And what I'm saying is, Dario would have played the game with a very specific visage, outward facing. But what you're saying, so I'm not saying Dario was, he was ruined by incentives. Power corrupts. I actually just think self-interest is amorally what is default unless we coordinate against it. That's what I'm saying. So someone's when people move their mouths, unfortunately us included, it's a decent amount of it is perception management. And I think we can still learn clearly, but I think a decent amount of it is perception management. And I'm with you. I think the initial impetus off the jump, Robespierre knew he would lob heads off if he ever put his butt on that throne, brother. He knew it. Off the jump, he knew it. Off the jump. As soon as the king snubbed him when he was singing his little song when the king came through his town when he was a child or whatever, he knew he'd be fucking lopping heads off. But you can't just say that. You got to maintain the perception until you get there to be able to flex it. But you're actually saying, even in the early days, and this is important to note, and I appreciate you bringing this up, even in the early days, the Anthropic deck was not, when it comes to raising money and actually getting people on board, it was not, we're going to really crack safety. It was, look, we're going to beat out Sam. We're going to get there first. This is what you're saying.
Yep. And to be clear, it goes even further than that. This was the plan. This is from DeepMind. The whole plan from DeepMind was, we're going to build AGI before anyone else can. We're going to get all the monopoly on AGI before anyone else can. Elon Musk got liquidated out of DeepMind and then created OpenAI out of this. Then, the whole breakup there happened. And even before DeepMind, there was MIRI, the Singularity Institute, and then later the Machine Intelligence Research Institute, which, is not considered a player by any modern standards, but they were the ideological forebearers whose whole thing, this is Eliezer's or Yudkowsky's old organization, which literally said, we are going to build AGI in secret, crack all of alignment, not tell anyone, not get the government involved, don't tell the general public, don't coordinate, just do it in secret because we're the good people. Like, it goes all the way back to 1998, this philosophy. This philosophy is not new. And the whole movement of AGI, this whole thought of we must build it and we're not going to coordinate with people, goes back to 1998.
In my opinion, it's what we should almost expect unless there is some semblance of governance. And this kind of takes us to two really quick things. I just want to be, I want to make sure we can touch on some of these important points here with you. One of them is, we're in violent agreement in very strange forms that we can expect this kind of motive and drive unless there's some way to coordinate against it. And I'm going to do some thinking on your definition of evil as those things that we should coordinate against because they're not in the common interest. I think it's a very interesting definition. But it's good to get your download there. And I think it's a cool framing. It's much better than that guy has incentives that are different than mine. And so I'm going to label him as evil, right? That's a very different framing that you have there. You've talked about beginning with conversations, kind of getting the track 2, track 1.5 deals going. Certainly, we are seeing some of that. I'm grateful to be in the room with the UN, OECD, whatever, in some of these sorts of discourses. And the IEEE's got their efforts and whatever. Not everybody's talking explicitly about AGI. But to move in that direction, you brought up another important point, which is, yes, we need to make sure, number one, we really don't die on the way. Like we just, if you birth something we can't control that has all sorts of powers beyond what we could possibly conceive of, we need to coordinate against that. But also there needs to be some sort of vision of like maybe a positive future. Now, what I've discovered over the course of the last handful of years here is, by golly, those far future visions are quite different. For some people, there is the idea of intelligence, eventually, hopefully treating humans quite well, if it's possible, blooming as far beyond people as we did beyond the fish with legs, because that would be maybe even more value. There's things maybe beyond love and humor that could be great and that could live on even if our sun explodes or something. And there's others who say, hey, 1 billion years from now, I would want Mars, the moon, Earth, and maybe some interstellar things with just humans, but hopefully humans that are really kind of more peaceful, more happy, and kind of treating each other. They still got to trim their fingernails. They still got to go to the bathroom, but they're humans. And that, for me, with kind of AI in some way as more of a servant, would be the positive outcome. And then there's everything in between. When you think about positive futures, what do you lay on the table?
So, just a quick disclaimer is that I will answer your question, but like just as a quick disclaimer about this kind of thing is that I genuinely think these things are distractions. Like I think these are genuinely distractions, and these are genuinely not productive to think about. And the reason is that just like it is not useful to philosophize about the communist utopia if a bear is currently ramming down your door. Like, it's just, you're being stupid if you do this. Like, and like, you're making a wrong choice. Like, if there's a clear, coordinatable thing in front of you that bottlenecks all of the future, like your survival and like your friends and your family's survival, you should coordinate around that thing. So what I mean by this is, for example, let's say there's 10 of us, we're huddled around the fire, and there's a bear and it's going to attack us, right? Well, some of us are communists, some of us are capitalists, some of us are Christians, some of us are, Jewish, whatever, right? So should we now all start the Communist Christian Party and only we will coordinate against the bear? And or should we all be like, fuck it, like, let's forget all of our utopias for a second, guys. There's a bear. So quick disclaimer, but I will answer your question. I think that what all these people have in common is that they don't want to get eaten by bears. They all have this in common. Similarly, I claim that everyone on Earth today has in common that they do not want to get killed by AGI in the next couple of years. So the most important thing is that we don't discoordinate because of stupid sci-fi utopian visions. And this is why I think they're counterproductive. So to answer your question, what do I think a good future is? Given what I've just said as well, the truth is that I don't think I should get to choose. So for me,
and I'm certainly not asking you to hold the scepter, Connor. I mean, that's a very different question. If you could rule the world, not the question. I'm saying if you can reflect down from 1,000 years and you say, you know what, it turned out okay. What the hell is okay to you? That's a simple question.
So for me, okay is that there was a just process. Is that whatever happened, there was a just process whereby humans got to reflect and choose what happens. And I'm not saying I know what that would look like. What would I want democracy and civilization and humanism. I want a human future, a humanist future. Now, a humanist future can keep being, humans with, clipping their nails, or it might be crazy transhumanists whose ancestors consented. to this kind of future. For me, humanism in this sense is this enlightenment ideal of like, humans making human choices through human means for the good of where we want humanity to go. And respecting each other, respecting disagreements, respecting that, maybe some people don't want to be transhumans and they want to, age and die. And I think that we should like talk to them about this and they should have a classic debate, but then be allowed to do that. I think there are hard philosophical conundrums of how to resolve incompatible tensions. Like, if one guy wants to kill the other guy, but he doesn't want to die, I mean, like, we're not going to let him do that, obviously. But there's a lot more subtle versions of this as well. And so for me, a good future looks like the ideal of the Enlightenment, of civilization, of like democratic and enlightened culture, where just like we have this like respect for human nature, soul, right? We have a just process and institutions that allow us to have these debates and disagreements in civil manner forever, however long they take, and then we act upon what is resolved from this.
Yeah. This is similar to how Hendricks sort of answered the question in some regard. So this idea that like, hey, I hope we just kind of make it and then we can sort of decide in a more collective and coherent way where this goes. I think that that's a rational position. I'm willing to be labeled as stupid if you wish to do so for me, although I won't take it personally or carry it with me, but you can do it if you'd like. I am of the belief that not all discussions of to what end, the question to what end, I think it's viable, reasonable, and there are impeti outside of stupidity to consider that some discussions of that sort would not be explicitly for the purpose of division and creating an AGI race. I think that some of those things could be talked about ahead of time without it being an AGI race. I think in an ideal sense, there might be a vision that is shared enough and good enough to bring about said coordination that we want. I think avoiding the negative is one part. I think possibly jeepers, that sounds pretty freaking good and like it leaves some great options open for humanity, is also maybe a motive that could bring us to coordinate. So I think about it in that sense. I do also unabashedly, ask what is this all about and sort of where is life and intelligence itself going. I don't expect to hold the scepter nor particularly wish to. But that's kind of my position, is that some of these things, there might be a way to create a locus from which coordination around. Like if I look at why does an enterprise adopt AI, like to be frank, Connor, bringing AI into an anti-money laundering process or drug development process or whatever, it's like no one wants to get fired for bringing on the wrong tech. It's like it costs money. It's going to like have to hire new people. Generally, you got to have a bunch of things that like we can already agree are like wrong. And then we also have to see that like our teams and our customers would probably be better off for this. And when you get enough of a motive force of both, then it's like, somebody cuts the check and potentially takes a swing at it. I'm not saying that will have to be the case for AGI. I just think it's reasonable sometimes to suspect that it might be a useful tool as part of the discourse. So just to be clear on your position, and it sounds like you're okay with that. You're kosher with that.
Oh, yeah. Like to be clear, maybe came out a bit stronger than I intended. What I'm not saying is that building good futures is not a potential thing to do. What I think is that there is a tendency that I have seen happen in practice, where in practice people spend all of their time talking about this and about arguing with other people that have like slightly different versions of their thing.
Yes. Oh,
rather
absolutely.
than focusing. And this is the specific thing I'm calling idiotic. I'm not saying idiotic is to like have things you look forward to and like trying to disentangle what those things are, in your mind, in your soul. Like, what do you actually care about? What do you actually love? And what could that look like in the future? Why are we building things? Or I think that is important. I also just think it's important to stay grounded and to be like, what's the plan? Like, all right, you have a vision. Like, I often tell people, write down your vision and then write down how you get there.
100%, and that's in the compendium. For those of you, it'll be linked in the show notes here. And in that regard, congenial with where you're headed. I mean, I think if you're hashing out slight variants of sort of what happens post AGI, such that just a race and a state of nature in a brute sense is the way we build it, it feels like, geez, man, no matter what your vision is, that's probably not a good way to get there. Some degree of concord and same-pagedness to get through kind of the next stage feels like what we should be absolutely focused on. And I consider myself as someone who absolutely is. But with that said, we can get kind of lastly here into what for you seem like kind of initial next steps that you would hope occur. And you could take this whatever way you want. I guess I would ask you to just say whatever you think is most important for the audience to understand. There might be things in national governments. You recently tweeted a member of I think it was a parliament in the United Kingdom who'd sort of overtly stated some of the risks of artificial general intelligence. It might be things in the intergovernmental space, with the UN or other groups. It might be things that you hope citizens and just people in tech or people concerned about this would do. When you think about kind of next moves that you would say, man, I think that's moving us in the right direction. What are the things you're hoping in the coming year or two? Lord knows how much time we have here, Connor, but maybe those timelines are too long for us. But what are the things that you would most see conducive as moving us in the right direction?
I think the most important single thing that could happen and I think is totally doable and that I and other people are working to make happen in the next year or two is just to make it to change the question from when do we stop when do we intervene with AGI to why are we not? This should be the question on every voter's mouth. This should be in every email to your congressperson. It shouldn't be when will you do something? It's why aren't you doing something? Right now. Do it right now. There's a We didn't get to talk about this, but I'll bring it up briefly. There is a general thing that is going on right now where a lot of the things that these big companies are doing to allow themselves to keep racing is kind of the same kind of stuff that big tobacco used to do to avoid regulation. Mm-hmm. And so there's a whole Wikipedia article about the big tobacco playbook. Everyone can.
Oh, that's great. You mentioned some of this in the compendium, correct?
Yes, exactly.
There's a good deal of this, so people can link to that. Yeah.
Exactly. So you can read about it in the compendium. I think this is very important to understand. And so the most important strategy that is being played is what's called fear, uncertainty, and doubt, or FUD. So this is a strategy that, it's existed before big tobacco, but big tobacco kind of made it famous. And so the way FUD works, and it's a very powerful strategy. That's why companies keep using it, because it's a very, very powerful strategy, is that if you currently benefit from the status quo, if things just continue business as usual, if you benefit from this, and people are critiquing you or attacking you or something, it is often much easier not to engage with your critics and show why they're wrong, but just to confuse everybody. Just create tons of bogus data, ask for more meetings and considerations. And, we must consult, how about we create a committee, perhaps, because there is controversy around the scientific validity, blah, 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 right? So this is exactly what big tobacco did. It's when they, when studies started coming out or people started talking about health concerns like lung cancer and smoking, they were well, there was science. They didn't say it's wrong. They didn't say, no, it doesn't cause cancer. What they said is, there's controversy around the causes. So we need to do more science so we have better data so we can know. Because we wouldn't want to act hastily. No, God, oh no, of course not. We wouldn't want to act too hastily. We must have prudence and wait. And so this is exactly what's happening right now. With stuff like evals. All the companies are saying oh, of course, we care about risk. But we don't know when the risk happens. So we must have more evals. Let's develop more evaluations of risks so we have more data. So then we can make choices. And let's call this what it is, stalling for time. This is stalling for time. No hate to the researchers involved. I think also the researchers that worked, on tobacco-funded cancer research, I don't think they were bad people. I think they were trying to do good cancer research, right? Some of them were evil, but most of them were genuinely trying to figure out something to this day, we don't really know what molecules exactly in tobacco actually cause lung cancer. We don't actually know this to this day. And so a lot of the tobacco companies would claim well, we don't know the mechanism, so we can't act. And the same thing is happening with these companies right now. Well, we don't know exactly where the risk will come from. We don't know, therefore we will do nothing. And that's the trick. So the trick is we don't know, which is true. And then they conclude, therefore we do nothing. But this is the wrong conclusion. The correct conclusion is we don't know, therefore let's stop until we do.
Yeah, I think so. This is a very crisp, and we'll go a little bit deeper into this because I like where you're headed here. I will say I think I can see some arguments that can smell reasonable in that eval camp, but also to your point, the people that are in the labs would of course have that to say because it's in their interest. Some people might listen to this and say, oh, why Connor, of course he has this other opinion because his influence and power will come from governance. And I'm not saying that it devalues what you're saying. I'm clearly speaking to you because I respect your opinions here. But to your point, there's motives involved there, and that we ought say, let's be proactive.
Yeah. So okay. I think we need to talk about this word incentives. It's come up multiple times and led to some confusions. Like when you say I'm acting on my incentives and this is not invalidating what I say, why? Why is that not invalidating? Like you say, of course I would believe this because of my incentives, but you say that doesn't invalidate it.
Well,
and
because you're laying out an argument. You're laying out an argument.
And so this
here.
is important, right? So like the truth fact, this is why I don't like talking about incentives often, because I think they can get distracting, because you could say, oh, they're pushing for evals because of their incentives. But like I feel like this doesn't actually get to the actual mechanism of what is happening. So why is the eval argument wrong? If you say the eval argument is wrong because it's their incentives, that's actually not correct. That's actually a wrong argument.
No, and that's not even my argument.
I'm not saying you're
here.
saying this, but there are people who just like stop thinking about this. So let's go in just a little, if we just have a second here to like dig into this just a little bit more. What is the actual problem with the eval thing? The problem is not that it is reasonable for scientists to think about how to evaluate dangers from AI systems. This is a completely reasonable thing to do. This is, we can argue about, is it the most efficient thing to do? Are they doing it correctly? Fine. The same thing as, is it a reasonable thing for a lung cancer scientist to study what chemical components of tobacco smoke cause cancer? I think this is a extremely reasonable thing to be studying, right? The question is, how does this relate to the political process? Who is setting the bar of evidence? Like, if tobacco companies got their way, they would say, well, once you've identified what chemical causes cancer in cancer smoke, okay, sure, then of course we'll regulate it. But like until then, well, let's wait and see. And that's the actual problem. So the scientists aren't necessarily doing anything wrong, but they are being used. They are useful idiots, to be rude to the scientists. And a similar thing is happening here. If we said, all right, you are not allowed to build new AGI systems until we figured out the evals and are confident in them, my answer would be, that's extremely reasonable. Okay, we do this, for example, with nuclear reactors. With nuclear reactors, you prove to the government that your system is safe long before you're allowed to build it. It's not that we build nuclear reactors and we wait until one of them melts down or we run meltdown evals on them after they're built. No, it's the other way around. You go to the government, say, here's my blueprint, here's why it's safe, here's all my data. The government takes a look at it and they'll say, yep, all right, fine, fair enough, go build it. And this is what we should be doing in this case. So this is why it's wrong for a political reason, because it's not wrong for any technical reason. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm following you. And I think our understanding of politics and incentives, I think the word definitions here are in different places and orders, but I'm completely following you and I'm completely congenial with this idea. With that said, kind of closing on this, because I think the shift of the conversation, clearly your priority, and I think there's rationale for it without a doubt. What I've seen, even in, let's just say, the OECD has an AI futures group. Bengio's in it. He talks about AGI risk. Ord is in it. Stuart Russell's one of the people chairing it. Almost no one else in the room is even willing to say AGI, and they kind of yawn and they look at their phone, even if Bengio says it. And so for me, something isn't clicking about making that tilt happen that you talked about. Like I've oftentimes been sitting there and sort of said something is wrong. And my suspicion is that people know nuclear reactors can melt down. They don't know AGI can run away. And there's a frog boiling thing here. And my suspicion is almost like and I'm not saying this is an answer, it's just an observation, but you probably have an idea of how you'd approach this. My guess is tilting that conversation from, yeah, let's figure it out when it happens, to why aren't we proactively doing something, is about getting people to see the future really does involve wild change with this tech, and the dangers are quite real with this tech. And I think until that clicks in a visceral level, and I almost wonder to myself, and I'm not a fatalist here, but I almost wonder, are people ever going to see that until something occurs? I'm not wishing for it. I'm not saying I believe that. What are your thoughts? Because I'm sure you've seen frustration with making that tilt happen. You've got some reasoned arguments. You've seen people roll their eyes when Bengio talks and other people talk. What's going to make that tilt happen for you?
Yeah, this is a great question. I think this is a super important topic to talk about. Okay, three things. First thing, talk about generally persuasion and how it works, and like what is persuasion and like what does it mean. The second, we'll talk about social epistemology, how do groups make decisions and process information. I swear this is relevant. And
no, I like it. I'm buckled in. I love it.
And the third thing I want to talk about is kind of like, how would you do this in practice? Like what are the actual mechanisms by which you would do this, and like what would be the outcomes you'd want to see? So to lay just a bit of groundwork. So you say these kind of things like people don't feel it, they don't see it, et cetera, et cetera. And this is true. This is correct. To a large degree, a lot of people don't feel it. And let's talk about the individual case, and then we'll talk about the group case, and then we can talk about the civilizational case. So the individual case is what I would call like persuasion. It's like you want to, but let's say persuasion in the good sense. You're trying to tell them something true, but they're not listening. Like this is a very common scenario, right? It's like you are trying to tell someone something true that is useful to them, but for some reason, they're not believing you. We're not talking about like lies or something right now, just simulacrum level 1. So my model of how this usually goes and how this usually works is that when you present an idea to a person, the first thing that happens is that it activates like 2 to 5 intuitions. It's usually 2 to 5. And sometimes more, sometimes it's less, but like it's usually 2 to 5. And they can have different strength, and they can come from all over the place. They can be heuristics, they can be memories, they can be emotional associations, they can be, associations with other concepts, whatever. But it's usually like 2 to 5 thoughts that are in people's heads. And 1 or more of these can be blocking. Or some can be blocking, some can be enabling, and then there's like cognitive dissonance, right? So usually when I talk to someone, and they're, smart, they're listening and so on, I talked about AGI, and they like reject it. What this means is that there is like some intuition, 1 or more, that is pushing against this, that is like not compatible with what I'm saying. And then what I need to do is I need to find what is that intuition and how can I address it? How can I placate it? How can I diffuse it? How can I appeal to it? Or how can I give it the information it needs? And this is very different between people. People have there's like a grab bag of most common ones. Let me give you a couple examples. So an example of of such a heuristic that you will often see when you present people with AGI is the heuristic, big things don't happen. This is a very general intuition, which is a very good intuition. Most of the time, if you're on social media and someone says the whole world is going to end, and like this is going to be different from everything else, this is usually wrong. Big things don't happen. Now, they do actually happen. So this heuristic doesn't mean true. But there is a heuristic, there's a felt sense of like, but big things don't really happen. So if you say all humanity is going to die, that doesn't happen. So this isn't a claim about any factual part of reality. It's an intuition. So if you start listing technical reasons or like whatever, or yelling at them, that doesn't address the intuition. Instead, you take the intuition, like, okay, this person doesn't think big things can happen. So now you have to give them an intuition, a vibe around other big things that have in fact happened, and why this also could be a big thing that happens. You can talk, for example, about nuclear weapons. That was a big thing. And then they'll be like, oh, whoa, you're right. That was a big thing. And it was technology. And so, okay, maybe tech can be big. Or like pandemics, or like climate change, or whatever, right? You can find something that's big and explain, look, here's an example where a really big thing happened pretty quickly. And then they'll be like, all right. But then maybe there's another intuition that you have to pick next. Like maybe they'll say they don't believe computers can have souls. Like it's like off of the agency one. It's just they think there is not necessarily verbally, to be clear. This is usually like gut feeling. Like they won't say this in those words, but they'll feel that like computers are like bricks. They're like on my desk, they don't really move. It's like where I watch, it's a tool. Like it's not a it's not a guy, and like only like people like do things, and like my computer's not a guy, so like
Absolutely.
it can't do a thing. And so then you have to appeal, like you give examples of how software already does many things and institutions do many things, and like, you know, a computer can just use a human as well, and then maybe they'll be like, oh, you're right, like, you know, a software system can get humans to do things, you know, just by convincing them or by paying them. All right, now I can think about this. So this is how I think about individual, like getting people to take it. It's usually that they have 2 to 5, sometimes more, sometimes less, things that you need to address. And I don't say this as a critique. I think this is a very reasonable way of reasoning, right? Like these heuristics are often actually very reasonable. Like the heuristic of like, but my computer isn't like that, is a reasonable
makes
heuristic.
Sense. Totally
it makes
makes
sense. Like, I'm not saying these people, like, I'm not saying this is stupid at all. There's a mistake a lot of people, I think, like on like my side kind of make, where they like present people with AGI and then they say people are stupid. It's like, look, they don't believe it because their friends don't believe it.
Idiots.
And I'm like, is that stupid? Like, let's say I'm not a tech guy, right? And like, or like, let's say like, okay, what's something like I don't know a lot about? I don't know a lot about like, you know, pandemics, right? But like, let's say someone tells me, oh, this new virus will be a huge pandemic. And I'm like, I'm not sure. So I ask a friend of mine who's a doctor, and I ask him, hey, do you think this will be a pandemic? And he's like, no, like, it's not. Don't worry about it. And then I stop believing it. Is that stupid? Like, I don't think that's necessarily a stupid thing at all. Or like, if I just look the news and see, hey, is anyone talking about this pandemic? And it turns out no one is. And I say like, oh, must be nothing. Is that unreasonable? Like, it might be wrong. Like, maybe it was actually a pandemic, right? But like, this is not an unreasonable way to think about reality. And so this is very important to understand. So like, I don't think people are stupid. Like, this is like a thing which like I think is like different from me and like a lot of Twitter people. Is like, I think normal people are generally not stupid. Like, they might be wrong about various facts, but often the way they get there is not unreasonable. Like, sometimes it is, right? Like, sometimes it's unreasonable, but like often it's not. Sorry, long tangent, but I think it's important.
That's great. Just to make sure we nutshell, you were going to touch on social epistemology, which I wasn't bored by at all. But I like where you're headed here, is that on an individual level, often reasonable suppositions and intuitions come to mind based on many touch points with reality. And 99% of the time when those come up, like, they serve the person adequately.
Exactly.
And so you're saying addressing those makes sense. I love that idea. You can get into the social side. This sounds good too.
Exactly. So, like, importantly, when I think about talking to people about AI and like teaching them about AGI or something, I approach it really deeply in my heart from the perspective, I am here to help you. Like, I'm not here to bulldoze your opinions. I'm not here to humiliate you. I'm not to own you. I mean, sometimes it's like, it's a debate with someone who I'm trying to, like, you know, defeat. Sure. You know, can be you in some or if it's for fun, right? You're having beers and you're just like fucking around, sure. But like, generally, the way I approach this is I'm trying to help. I have a useful piece of information that I think you want, and I want to help you be able to integrate this piece of information, use this information. How can I help you get there? Like, this is how I think about this. Is like, how can I help you? How can I help you? By giving you something that will be useful to you.
Yeah.
And this leads to the social epistemology thing. So, individual is nice, right? This is a nice little framing of like how you can think about it, whatever. But many people have this experience of they have a great conversation with someone, they totally convince them, they're totally bought in, then they like don't talk for a couple of weeks, and then like all their friends like don't believe it, and then they come back and then like they don't believe it anymore, right? Everyone knows this. Like, everyone has had a conversation like this, right? So here we get to the second part of like, you know, epistemology at mass scales. It is a group epistemology. Is that epistemology is fundamentally a social process. It is not an individual process. You know, maybe there are some, you know, super autistic people who like try to bake their epistemology as asocial as possible. You know, they want to derive everything themselves from scratch or whatever. But like in practice, a lot, even most of our cognition, most of our epistemology is distributed. It happens through social networks. It happens through our friends, our families, our media, our environment, our culture, etc. Like, most of my opinions are not mine. They come from God knows where, right? They come from my culture, from my upbringing, from my media, from my friends, my family. And often people bring this up with like a cynical tone. They're like, ooh, you're just a sheep. You get your opinions from somewhere else. And I'm like, that's what it means to be human. Do you want me to recompute everything from scratch? I'd still be in the Stone Age. Like that's literally stupid. Like
yeah, absolutely, I'm following.
It would be
completely
like copying. Like one of the funny thing is, like the number one biggest difference between human babies and chimp babies is if you demonstrate something to a baby, they will do it. Like if you point at something, they'll like try to point. If you like do a task, they'll do the task exactly the same. They'll like copy. If you stumble, they'll stumble too because they think it's important. They will copy you so carefully that they will like copy the flaws too. Chimps, meanwhile, don't. They don't give a shit. Like they just like do. They like, how do I get food? Like they don't care. They don't follow. They like if you show them how to get food, they'll do it. But they don't care. Like they will just do it however to get the food. Well, the baby will actually copy your exact behavior. So this is an important thing. So humans are a social species, or like almost a hive mind species. So the actual level of reasoning is not the individual, it's the group. So most thinking happens on a distributed kind of hive mind level, like a social level. So the thing you want to interact with to cause change at large scale is actually groups, not individuals. Now, the individuals are important. They're an important component of the group. But there's an aspect of every group which is emergent, which is not just the individuals. So how do you get groups to think and talk about a subject? So there's a lot we could talk about here, but there's one specific concept I want to bring up, which will bring us to the third point, which is what is called common knowledge. So there's knowledge, which is you know something. There's some fact, you know it. And then there's might be shared knowledge, like you know, or like multiple people can know a thing. You know a thing, I know a thing. Cool. But then there's common knowledge, which is you know that I know that we know that X. Like all of us know, like that all you know that I know that we know that I know that you that I that we that you know infinite regress. Like all of us know everything on. And these two are extremely different. This is unintuitive maybe, but these are extremely different and extremely important. Groups can only reason about common knowledge. They cannot reason about private knowledge, at least in practice, at least in most situations. What this means is, like, let's say there is a presidential election. There's three candidates, A, B, and C. Let's say A and B are the incumbents. They kind of suck. No one really likes them, but it's going to be like close to 50-50, right? It's always that way. And then there's candidate C, and let's say he's great. Like we love him. He's so cool. He's so good, but he's probably going to get 0 votes. So let's say we slightly prefer A over B, like you and B. Like we all like kind of prefer A rather than B. But like we would love C. Like each of us like loves C, right? But we don't know that the other people know this. What happens? A wins, not C. Even if all of us wanted to vote for C, we will vote for A because we don't know the other people who are going to vote for C. There's a classic kind of like common knowledge thing. So the thing that we need to do is we have to all tell each other, by the way, I'm going to vote for C. And they're like, holy shit, you're voting for C? I'm also good. Okay, then I'll do it too. You're going to do it too? All right, let's do it. And then C wins. And you get the thing you actually want. Because then the group can reason about this. If everyone individually knows C is great, but they never tell each other, then the group will act irrationally, quote unquote. So the most important thing is to make AI risk and things common knowledge. It must be an object in social reality that you are allowed to reason about. It's the third thing. What do we do? One of the most important things is just to make these things, there's a critical mass of people that not just know this, but are saying it publicly, that are publicly saying, I am telling the group, this is a thing I care about, and I think the group should be thinking about this. And then once you get to a certain threshold where more and more people start saying this, and larger people, then the group can reason about and act upon these things. And the reason I think this is the core step is because, let me tell you, I've talked to many people in many countries from many backgrounds, and the core intuition of, hey, there are these companies who are building AI systems that might be smarter than humans, and they don't know how to control them. How do you feel about that? And the answer is always bad. That seems terrible. That's scary. And this is a good intuition. These are not technical people, right? They don't know necessarily about computers. They don't necessarily know about AI, whatever. But this is a good intuition. It's true, even if it's not technical. So this is like the candidate C thing. The truth is that actually I claim that the majority of the public, and there are polls for this as well, the majority of the public actually do want AI regulated today. It's just not common knowledge. Individuals have this. The group doesn't. So we have to move it from the individual to the group. Part of this is persuading key nodes in the graph. There are key people in the graph. Yeah. Another thing is just educating people. Another thing is saliency, just bringing it to attention, not even teaching, just reminding them to think about it and to bring it up. Another thing is, just having, these key nodes, these like high status people just say, this is a thing we can talk about now. And this then allows us to actually address and solve the problem. And this is what these companies are fighting so hard to prevent. What they are fundamentally trying to prevent is to prevent us from voting for candidate C, not by trying to convince us of how bad candidate C is, but just by confusing everybody, just making it like hard to vote, just like confusing. There's so much data and controversy and like, who knows? And so this is why it's so important to be public and state publicly these things and to keep the message simple. Don't make it complicated. Don't talk about which compound in tobacco smoke causes cancer. Yeah. Just talk about smoking causes cancer. This is a problem. AGI, we don't know how to control AGI, is going to kill everyone. That's the message. Everything else is extraneous.
Yeah, I feel like there's an entire, set of books, never mind short interviews, about just this part of our conversation. I've had many, walking out of those OECD rooms and other venues, I've had many conversations about like what is going on here. And I think a lot of what you're addressing around sort of this private versus public, that there's so much relevance to this in the broader discourse. And my hope is that, Connor, between, yourself and various other folks that are out there speaking about this, just some of the normality of it being talked about, whether, in the parliament a second time, he's not a weirdo. There was another guy that talked about it before. When like the weirdo points go away because it's common enough and in big enough nodes, at some point my hope is Bengio will talk about loss of control and like most of the room won't start scrolling on their iPhone. Because they'll be like, this is a thing, actually. I saw somebody else talk about this. And what you're saying is that we need to embrace that that's the process.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. This is the process. It's just like we can kick and scream that, it should be rational and actually evident. And like that's just, brother, that's just not how the world works. All right. Like you can complain about it as much as you want. You can kick and cry. And that's just how a child reacts to this problem. And adults see it's just like understand the system, understand how does social epistemology work? How does information flow? And then and again, this is like what it means to be civilized. What it means to be like, revolution is not civilized, like sometimes in some, extreme scenarios. But like if you live in a generally lawful country, which is generally lawful and generally democratic, then revolution is defection, is that you are defecting against the norm of how we solve problems. Like you agreed as a civilized person that we have a process to solve problems, and it involves media and convincing people and, having patient, nonviolent debates. And what I say is, do the process, do civics. Like this is what it means to be a civilian, is this you don't do violence, you don't do epic crazy shit, you don't revolt or anything like this. What you do is you engage with the institutions of decision-making and reasoning. And this is what it looks like.
I think, there's a lot of ways to apply this last 5 to 10 minutes of our conversation here today for the folks tuned in, and I'm really glad we were able to end the interview on a brother comment. I'm really, really happy that actually happened. Wasn't expecting that one, Connor. I know that's all we have for time, but I'm really glad we got to fully unpack this and have some fun today. It's been a blast interviewing you today.
Yeah, thank you so much, man.
Of course.
So that's all for this episode of The Trajectory. A big thank you to Connor for being able to be here with us, and thank you to you for tuning in all the way through to the end of this episode. I thought that the whole back half of this episode, the turn we took around what influence looks like, was remarkably well thought out. Probably the best articulation of influence and policy that I've sort of had in many, many discourses in the intergovernmental world. And I think there's many people who are tuned in now who are involved, again, UN, OECD, whatever else, who've asked the question, how the heck do we make this normal? And I think Connor's roadmap is probably a pretty darn good one. Clearly, Connor and I have differing opinions about the importance of discussing sort of the grand trajectory after we have AGI sort of under control. But he was willing to entertain that conversation a little bit here. You'll notice in the safety crowd, it's often sort of not a kosher topic to talk about, but we went there because I do. And in our last episode of the AGI Governance series, I won't even keep it a secret with you, we speak with Yudkowsky himself. Not Yudkowsky simply yelling about AGI risk, which he does very, very well and very articulately in a way that I've personally benefited from a lot over the years in terms of his analogies and his parables and his tweets. But we go pretty deep with him about what AGI governance would look like in practice from the Yudkowskian lens, and it's not just bombing data centers. And we also get into what he would want to do if we controlled AGI. So in our final episode of the AGI Governance series, we speak with Yudkowsky, and we talk about governance, but we also paint kind of trajectory of post-humanity picture and how he would like to get there. Extremely unique. Never seen him write about this, never seen him speak about this. Very exciting episode. So again, we'll wrap this one. Huge thank you to Connor. Thank you to you. And tune in 2 weeks for Yudkowsky himself.